Hello, my name is Claire and my partner is Brianna. Today we're going to be presenting on the court case of Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. Our presentation is going to consist of facts, prior decisions, ruling, rationale, scope, the significance of the case, some questions to consider, and our references. So to start off the facts, this case actually originated in 1951, even though it ended in 1954. It started in Topeka, Kansas, when the Topeka Public School District refused to enroll the daughter of a Black resident at the school that was closest to their home. This child who was denied access to public education close to her home was Linda Brown, and her father was actually the primary plaintiff, and his name was Oliver Brown. Included in this case were 13 parents and 20 students.
So Thurgood Marshall argued that separate is not equal on behalf of the NAACP, and he also argued that the segregation of schools was a violation of the 14th Amendment. Thurgood Marshall was later appointed the first African American Supreme Court Justice, and this particular case technically involves 5 consolidated cases that we'll discuss in the next few slides. So the 5 cases were Briggs versus Elliott, Davis versus County School Board, Brown versus Board of Education that we just introduced, Bowling versus Sharp, and Belton versus Gebhardt. So as a part of Briggs versus Elliott, Harriet Briggs was one of 20 parents who brought a suit against the school board president after several requests to provide school buses for Black students had been ignored. Parents then attempted to enroll their students in the local all-white schools. However, their requests were denied. In Davis versus County School Board, Barbara Rose Jones, a high school student, organized a student strike because of poor school conditions. The school didn't have a gym, cafeteria, teacher restrooms, or an infirmary. The NAACP filed a suit on behalf of the students against the county school board. In Bowling versus Sharp, there were 11 African American students who were turned away from the John Philip Sousa Junior High School in 1950, despite the school having several empty and available classrooms. Then Belton versus Gebhardt, there were 2 African American students who were forced to attend a segregated high school as opposed to their local high school. Parents petitioned for their children to attend the local all-white school, and again, they were denied admission in 1951. So here we have the prior decisions that were made in these 5 court cases. In Bowling versus Sharp, the U.S. District Court dismissed the case because in a recent case it had been determined that segregated schools were considered constitutional in Washington, D.C. The U.S. Supreme Court decided to hear this case along with the 4 segregation cases later on. In Briggs versus Elliott, a suit challenging segregation was filed. The U.S. District Court determined that school segregation would not be abolished, but that the school board would work towards ensuring that all students were equal. All schools were equal, sorry. Then in Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, 13 parents filed suit against the Topeka Board of Education for not admitting their children to local schools. The U.S. District Court did accept psychological evidence that African American students were impacted adversely by segregation, but ruled against the plaintiffs. In Davis versus County School Board, there was a suit filed on behalf of 177 students against the county school board because of inadequate school conditions. The U.S. District Court ruled unanimously that they found no harm in either race. And then finally, in Belton and Bula versus Gebhardt, the state requested for the case to be heard by the Delaware Court of Chancery. It was determined that the plaintiffs were denied equal protection and should be admitted to the all-white school. The decision was later appealed by the Board of Education.
So for the ruling, I think we all know that eventually Brown versus Board of Education worked its way up to the Supreme Court, but it started in the district court in Topeka, which actually ruled in favor of the Board of Education. They found that segregation in public schools actually did have a detrimental effect on Negro children, but they ruled against them anyway. Negro and white schools were equal in regards to, or at least so they said, they were equal in regards to buildings, transportation, curriculum, and the educational qualifications of teachers. Since this was not true, the next step for the Browns and the other people that were involved in this case was the Supreme Court.
So the Supreme Court ruling, for the Supreme Court ruling, the 5 consolidated cases were heard before the U.S. Supreme Court. The Chief Justice was Earl Warren. He strongly believed that segregation was unconstitutional. Psychological evidence utilizing dolls was incorporated into this case to defend the ruling. And finally, the court ruled unanimously that against school segregation. So they believed that it was unconstitutional for schools to be segregated, and while they were separated, they were not equal. So the rationale, there was a reinterpretation of Plessy versus Ferguson. So again, separate was determined not to be equal. So while the facilities did seem to be equal, students were not receiving the same education. Additionally, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So today, education is perhaps the most important function of our local and state governments.
Next, we have scope. So who did this affect? It affected young children across the country, both Black and white. It affected public schools and the public school education system and who had access to what. It became more equal. It also created more educational opportunities for those who were not white, because previously it was, there was segregation. And this actually created a lot of criticism in the South in the 1950s when it was determined by the Supreme Court, because there was still, and one could argue is still, a lot of racism that exists in that area of the country. Going on, in Brown versus Board of Education 2, the court directed school boards to desegregate, quote unquote, with all deliberate speed, and returned desegregation cases to the district courts and lower federal courts.
So now we have the significance of this case. So as we just mentioned, the Supreme Court ordered desegregation of all public schools with all deliberate speed. So while the Supreme Court did order desegregation, it was still difficult in the later 50s and in the 60s to fully mandate this. There were people who were very opposed to this occurring. Also, it did overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. So it was the first time where it was really challenged that separate was not necessarily equal. It also fueled the civil rights movement, which led to desegregation of other areas. In addition to the civil rights movement, it also helped with the Civil Rights Act, and then later on with the Voting Rights Act. And here are some questions to consider. So where were all schools in the United States segregated before Brown versus Board of Education deemed segregation unconstitutional? So was this kind of happening throughout the United States, or was it really in maybe certain pockets? Why do we think that Brown versus Board of Education was controversial at the time? So why was it such a big deal that we had segregation in schools? Why was it so controversial? And then finally, do we think that Brown versus Board of Education helped fuel the civil rights movement? So as we mentioned, a few years later, after Brown versus Board of Education, was the beginning of like the civil rights movement. And I think a lot of it could be attributed to us realizing that because entities were separate, they couldn't be equal. And we have psychological evidence that this doesn't result in them being equal. So in summary, Brown versus the Board of Education helped ensure that all students are having access to an equal quality of education. And it led to us realizing that we needed to desegregate in other areas. And there is definitely some controversy about this particular decision, but I do think they were headed in the right direction by desegregating schools.
And here are our references. So we hope you enjoyed our presentation, and we hope you learned something about Brown versus Board of Education. Thank you for listening.